Rent inflation has been a topic that hits home quite literally for millions of people across the country. But there's finally some good news. Rent inflation has been slowly cooling down for the past 18 months. It might not be a dramatic reversal, but there's something to be said for taking our foot off the gas and feeling a little bit of relief. The nuances of rent inflation and inflation in general can be a little confusing, especially when we're constantly bombarded with headlines about rising prices. So let's break it down in a way that's light, easy to understand, and hopefully just a bit entertaining. First things first, let's talk about inflation. Inflation doesn't necessarily mean prices are going up at the same rate forever, and it definitely doesn't mean prices are dropping. Imagine inflation as the speed at which your car is traveling down a highway. For the past few years, that car has been moving pretty fast, especially when it comes to rent prices. But for the last 18 months, the speed has been decreasing. The car is still moving forward, just not as fast as before. If rent inflation is cooling down, it doesn't mean rent is getting cheaper. It just means rent is increasing at a slower pace. It's like taking your foot off the gas pedal. The car is still moving, but it's not accelerating as aggressively as it was before. And here lies the catch. Prices are still high. Rent hasn't magically returned to what it was pre-pandemic. Instead, we're seeing a return to more typical levels of rent increases, and many people are left wondering when or if they might ever catch a break. It's a fair question. If rent inflation is cooling down, why are prices still sky high? The answer lies in the difference between inflation and deflation. Rent inflation cooling doesn't mean that rent prices are decreasing. In fact, most experts agree that rent prices are here to stay unless something drastic happens like a market correction, a recession, or increased regulations. Unfortunately, none of those options come without their own set of problems. The reality is that the rate at which rent prices are increasing is returning to more normal levels. In the past year or so, we've moved away from the post-pandemic spikes and back toward more stable territory, meaning annual rent increases of around 2 to 3%. For anyone still recovering from the sudden surge in rent prices over the last few years, this might not feel like much of a consolation prize, but at least it's not the relentless climb we were seeing. One thing that's important to remember is that rent inflation is far from a one-size-fits-all story. Depending on where you live, your experience with rent increases may look quite different from someone else's. For example, while rents have started to ease in parts of the southern states, like North Carolina and Tennessee, areas in the Northeast and Midwest are still experiencing significant growth in rent prices. And if you happen to live in a particularly high-demand city like Atlanta, where rents are still off the charts and rising higher, you might not be feeling any of the effects of this so-called cooling just yet. But don't be afraid to negotiate. If you're living in a city where housing inventory is expanding, it's worth considering making a counter-offer when your lease is up for renewal. Your landlord might prefer keeping a reliable tenant rather than risking a vacancy, especially if the market isn't quite as hot as it used to be. It's easy to understand why so many people are confused by the difference between inflation cooling down and deflation. Deflation is when prices actually drop, meaning the cost of rent would go down. But what we're seeing now isn't deflation, it's just lower inflation. In other words, prices are still increasing, just not at the lightning pace we saw in 2022 and early 2023. To make it even more confusing, inflation is cumulative. Think of it as compound interest. When prices increase year over year, they compound on top of the already inflated prices. So even if inflation is cooling down, we're still dealing with prices that have risen significantly over the last few years. Imagine buying a basket of oranges. One year, it costs you $10. The next year, it costs $12. That's a 20% increase. The following year, it costs $13. That's an 8% increase. The rate of inflation has gone down, but the price is still higher. That's what we're dealing with now. Prices are still up, but they're not skyrocketing as quickly. Even though rent inflation is cooling, the reality is that landlords, property management companies, and apartment complexes are rarely willing to lower rents once they've been increased. People have simply gotten used to prices being this high, and unless there's a major economic shift or a sudden drop in demand for housing, it's unlikely that we'll see rents coming down. Many landlords argue that their costs have gone up as well, thanks to rising interest rates, maintenance costs, and property taxes. And while that's certainly true, it doesn't make it any easier for renters who are already stretched thin. For many people, it feels like we're stuck in a cycle where rents keep going up, but wages don't keep pace. If you're feeling frustrated by this, you're definitely not alone. A lot of people feel like they're stuck paying sky-high rent with no real end in sight. But there are some ways to try and push back, like negotiating your rent or looking for incentives to stay in your current place. So, is there any hope that rents will go down in the near future? Well, it's complicated. Some economists believe that a market correction could bring prices down, especially in areas where the rent hikes were particularly aggressive. Others think that the best we can hope for is for rent prices to stabilize rather than continue to climb at such high rates. There's also the possibility of increased regulation. Some states and cities are already looking at rent control measures to help ease the burden on tenants. However, these kinds of policies are often controversial and can take a long time to implement. Plus, they often come with unintended consequences that might make housing even harder to come by. And, of course, there's always the looming possibility of a recession. While a recession could, in theory, lead to lower rents, it's not exactly an ideal solution, especially given the economic pain that would come along with it. It's a bit of a catch-22. Lower rents might be a relief for some, but the overall impact of a recession would likely cause more harm than good. If you're a renter feeling the pinch, there are a few things you can do to try and make your situation a little more manageable. For one, don't be afraid to negotiate when your lease comes up for renewal. If you're a reliable tenant who pays rent on time, your landlord might be willing to work with you to keep you around, especially if the market in your area is starting to cool off. You can also consider looking for move-in incentives if you're planning to relocate. Many apartment complexes offer discounts or reduced rent for new tenants, especially if they're having trouble filling units. It might take a bit of research, but finding a place that offers these kinds of incentives could help you save some money in the long run. And if you're really struggling, it might be worth exploring your options for assistance. Some cities and states have programs designed to help renters who are facing financial difficulties. And while these programs aren't a long-term solution, they could help bridge the gap if you're having trouble making ends meet. The reality is that rent inflation may be cooling, but prices are still high, and they're likely to stay that way for the foreseeable future. It's a tough pill to swallow, especially for those of us who have seen our rent prices skyrocket over the last few years. But understanding the difference between lower inflation and deflation can help put things in perspective, even if it doesn't make it any easier to pay the bills. For now, it's all about adjusting to the new normal and trying to make the best of a challenging situation. Rent prices might not be going down anytime soon, but with a little bit of patience, negotiation, and resourcefulness, you can hopefully find some ways to manage the cost and keep your housing situation as stable as possible.